Hello, my name is Fred Menk and I'm going to step you through the development of the Decadal Plan for Australian space science on behalf of the Australian Academy of Science. First, a few words about the Academy of Science. It was formed in 1954 as an Australian Learned Academy, and its functions are to champion, celebrate and support excellence in Australian science, to promote Australia's international scientific engagement, to build public awareness and understanding of science, and to provide independent, authoritative and influential scientific advice, for example, to government. Members who are Fellows of the Academy of Science are at the highest level of scientific achievement in Australia. There's something like 20 Fellows elected each year. There are other learned academies in Australia, and the Australian Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering is one of those, and it has a similar structure to the Academy of Science. The Academy of Science has a website, of course, and you can go and have a look at it. It's actually very interesting, and under the tab Videos and Publications are a whole series of publications, videos and information on areas of science of importance to the general public. For example, vaccines, immunisation, genetic modification, and a whole bunch of other things. So I encourage you to have a look at those at your leisure. A little bit about national committees. Within the Academy of Science, there are 22 national committees representing different discipline areas. The function of these national committees is to link these disciplines across Australia and internationally with the international scientific organisations such as the International Council for Science. The national committees are also responsible for advising on developments relevant to their discipline and for developing 10-year strategic plans. These strategic plans, in essence, assess the current state of knowledge in that discipline, identify and set priorities for the next decade, and outline strategies to achieve these priorities and goals. So just to summarise, within the Academy of Science, there are 22 of these national committees. One of these is the National Committee for Space and Radio Science, and that's a committee which I've had the privilege of chairing. So it links Australian activities in space and radio science with a number of key international organisations, and I've listed them there. These are major international bodies who have conferences every 2 or 4 years, and to which Australia has official representation. Our committee, the National Committee for Space and Radio Science, like all the other committees, meets at least once a year, but in actual fact does most of its work online. This work includes a range of things. For example, we're responsible for hosting conferences in Australia, both domestic and international conferences, but also, for example, for making submissions to government on issues of importance. Our committee also links with other national committees, such as the National Committee for Astronomy, the National Committee for Physics, the Committee for Materials Science, Committee for Antarctic Research, and other national bodies, such as the Academy of Social Sciences, the Space Industry Association of Australia, the Australian Institute of Physics, of course, the Australian Space Agency, the Victorian Space Science Education Centre, IEEE, Engineers Australia, and any other number of groups that you'd like to think of. So what exactly is the span or the scope covered by the National Committee for Space and Radio Science? In other words, what is space and radio science? So space science encompasses space-based studies of Earth's surface, meteorology and climate. In other words, looking down upon Earth from above to understand these systems. The Earth-Moon system, the planets and small bodies of the solar system. So in other words, planetary science within our solar system. The upper atmospheres of Earth and our solar system planets. In other words, studies of near-Earth space and propagation of the solar wind, and plasmas in the solar system, including planetary magnetospheres. In addition to that, relevant physics, materials science and life sciences related to space activities. And the radio side covers the properties and applications of electromagnetic fields and waves, in other words radio waves, all the way from low frequencies used for everyday radio communication through to the optical range used increasingly in optical fibres and for free space optical communications, including, for example, applications to radio astronomy, electromagnetics and biology and medicine, and so on. So really a very, very broad range of topics. You can have a look at the website for the National Committee for Space and Radio Science. If you go to the Academy of Sciences website and look at the different committees, you'll find the website for the National Committee, and there's a little peek at what it shows. Incidentally, there's a newsletter, Space and Radio Science newsletter, which comes out every couple of months, and you're more than welcome to sign up to it. At the moment, we have about 500 people on the mailing list. And the newsletter contains information of interest, grant opportunities, new developments, and things like that. You're more than welcome, as I say, to sign up to it. Some of the work of the National Committee over the past few years was the first Decadal Plan for Space Science, which came out in 2010 and went for, well, until a few years ago. It's now very, very much obsolete, overtaken by developments. And then in 2017, we developed a vision document of space science and space technology in Australia. And that document came out on the eve of the announcement that Australia would have a space agency. So let's come now to discussion about the next Decadal Plan for Australian space science. What's the context for it? What's the vision? Our broad vision is that the mission of our plan and the mission of Australian space science is to build Australia a long-term productive presence in space which advances national needs through world-class science, technology and education, and embracing core values of equity, collaboration and innovation. So this is, if you like, our guiding principle. How was this plan developed? Well, it's a long story and I'll break it down into a number of small chunks. First of all, the plan is aimed at an audience of decision makers, so key stakeholders, people at relevant decision-making levels in government and key organisations. It also addresses academia, that is researchers, and industry, people in the space industry, and of course the general public. So we started the process over a couple of years ago through community consultation via town hall meetings, ascertaining, that is, what the space and radio science community felt were the key things that needed to come up in a plan. The next step was to seek funding for the whole process because you need money for it to happen, otherwise nothing will take place. The first practical step beyond that was to form a series of expert working groups, and I'll come to these in a little bit. Each of these working groups was headed by a chair and he or she was assisted by a group of experts, something up to 10 or so experts, representing the best capability in that field in Australia. These working groups went off, held their discussions. They were given a brief to look at the current state of play in their discipline area and to look at the sort of developments they would think would be important over the next 10 years or so, and to come out and write up their recommendations in a report. So they all did that. We then formed an expert working group which had diverse membership, not just all academics, but diverse membership, which took into account all these working group discussions and reports in order to develop the actual plan document. This expert working group we had many, many interesting discussions over some months, and eventually were able to produce a first draft of our plan document. That went out for community consultation and peer review. We had a lot of feedback from that, and so as a result of that, produced a revised draft, which then went for review to the National Committee and back to that executive working group. After that, the next step is approval by the Executive Committee of the Academy of Science itself, who, as you would imagine, give it a close scrutiny and come back with further points. And then the final step in the exercise is to actually produce the document, to launch it publicly and have a campaign around it, which will engage the audience, that is the stakeholders, academia, industry, and the public. This entire process of developing the plan has to be aware of what has taken place in recent years and what is taking place currently. And this is really interesting because while the plan was happening, everybody else was doing their job as well. And so we had roadmaps being developed, for example, by the Australian Space Agency. We had a parliamentary inquiry into the space industry taking place, and we had reports coming out from a whole host of other organisations. So all of those developments had to be taken into account as well. I mentioned the expert working groups that were formed to inform the development of the plan. So here's a list of these working groups. As I say, each one had a chair and then a number of experts within it. Each one did their job and then produced a report outlining what they felt were the important developments that we needed to be aware of. So two of the working groups focused on surveys of the community, a broad-ranging demographic survey, and then a more targeted survey of research capacity and research priorities. There was a working group on education, training, careers, working group that focused on the workforce, where it is at present and what it needs in order to provide Australia's capabilities into the future. Then we had working groups focused on technology aspects that we need to develop, and then scientific questions like planetary science, heliosphere science, that is the region dominated by the sun and the solar wind, space situational awareness and space weather, Earth observation, which includes things like meteorology, space communication, space-based position navigation and timing, and space health and life sciences. This list is in no special order, so don't be excited if your favourite topic is at the top or the bottom or in between. That has no particular significance. So what are the key points that emerged out of all of this? When we looked at all the reports, when we look at the surveys, when we actually go through the plan process and develop our document, what are the key things that stand out? So first of all, and this is perhaps no surprise to most people, space-derived activities and services are integral to Australia's economic, environmental and national security. In actual fact, Australia has a critical dependence upon space-derived capabilities, perhaps more so than most other countries, because we're a large spread out country with a relatively small population concentrated in centres. So we have both large urban communities and dispersed and discrete regional communities. We have infrastructure spanning large areas. We have a region of influence across the South Pacific, and we're critically dependent upon space-derived activities, for example, for communications capability, for navigation, for GPS, and a whole host of other activities that you perhaps wouldn't immediately think of, but which are fundamentally important. The second thing is that the whole space sector is undergoing radical change. It's moving from being dominated by large government capabilities to increasingly commercial and open market participation in space activities. That means SMEs, small and large businesses, commercial groups are entering into the space sector, and this is completely changing the dynamic. This is providing new transformative opportunities, but also providing a new series of risks. Coupled on top of all of that are the various geopolitical tensions and strategic interests that we need to be aware of. The next key point is what space science does. Space science generates new knowledge, it generates disruptive innovation, and provides practical benefits. That's the core of it. Space science does new stuff challenging stuff. Because it's challenging, you have to be innovative, and at the end of the day, there are very often practical benefits that flow down to people on the ground. Space science is a fundamental enabler for space industry. You can't pick the apples off a tree if the tree hasn't grown first, right? The science capability enables the growth of the space industry and underpins the space programs of our partners and our own space aspirations. If we look at our partner agencies, they have strong and vigorous space mission programs because they understand that forming teams of people, of cross-disciplinary teams, engineers, academics, industry, and so on, to come up with new solutions to problems on how to make things work in space, that drives innovation, and that also results in spin-offs with practical benefits for people on the ground. So that's the second key point. The third key point is that a national science-driven space program, which includes space missions, would allow Australia to partner with international programs. And as I mentioned before, would stimulate technical innovation, would most logically address key national priorities, would grow capability, and would inspire citizens. Kids at school will be excited about an Australian space program. For example, sending little CubeSats to the moon or to other planets. At the same time, we have a need to develop sovereign capability, to develop our own spacecraft, to meet our own needs. These needs might relate, for example, to Earth observation. You know, we're fundamentally dependent on Earth observation for a whole host of activities across Australia. And all of the Earth observation data we rely on comes from overseas suppliers. So that's a risk. So in order to mitigate that risk, we ought to have some of our own capability. It simply makes sense. And similarly, we need sovereign capability in other areas, critical areas, such as, for example, defence. Space-derived capabilities are also essential to critical infrastructure. You may or may not realise, for example, that Australia's very large electricity distribution grid that straddles the east coast from Queensland down to Tasmania, across the east coast cities and through to Adelaide, that is at risk from space weather. It turns out we are world experts in developing models to understand that risk, and we could lead international expertise in predicting and mitigating these risks. So these are some of the key points on why we should have a national science-driven space program, which includes ground-based observations, includes modelling efforts, and includes space missions in order to actually have some material in space to take some measurements. So, in our plan, after all our discussions and deliberations, we've identified specific opportunities which capitalise on our national strengths. And these opportunities straddle a range of areas. One of those is using space as a vector to enhance engagement in STEM activities and to help grow the skilled workforce. There are critical shortages in skilled capability in Australia, and we're seeing those amplified at the moment when, as a result of the COVID pandemic, our borders were shut to people coming in from overseas. So that's the first thing. We can use space as a vector to enhance engagement in STEM activities. As I mentioned before, we're experts in space weather research, and we can harness and build on that to help protect our critical infrastructure and advance space situational awareness activities. In other words, being able to track and predict where objects are in space. Given our large continental extent, our clear skies, and our extensive infrastructure, optical and radar and other type of sensors, this actually is a no-brainer. We ought to have an ongoing Earth observation program addressing national and global challenges. One of the national challenges I mentioned is the risk of data supply. Other national challenges naturally relate to environmental monitoring and environmental management, and that's also a global challenge when we think about climate change. And we can certainly map into those programs. Another opportunity is an R&D program focused on next-generation communications, positioning, navigation, and timing capabilities. We're at the stage now where thousands of satellites are being launched every year. The biggest market for satellites is communications. And at the moment, the radio spectrum is very crowded. We see overlap of users in the radio space. So we need to better manage this. We need better technology to enable us to use the radio spectrum more efficiently. And we need to, most importantly, be able to learn how to use free space optical communications. That would represent a revolutionary breakthrough. We have all the capabilities in Australia, especially given our strengths in optical astronomy. And again, this is a no-brainer. What we need, however, is a program to support the R&D that's necessary, an ongoing sustained program. And of course, not least, a research program in space life sciences, including space medicine and human factors, and space agriculture and nutrition. It's not usually well known that Australia's expertise in life sciences extends into the space area. In actual fact, we conduct work which engages many space agencies, and we have some unique capabilities, for example, for analog stations, analog facilities in Australia or in Antarctica that can be used to mimic or test capabilities that might be deployed in space. Most importantly, the technologies and capabilities we develop, which are relevant to human spaceflight missions, also have applications to people on Earth. The sort of difficulties that people experience on long spaceflight missions, supplying health and medical and agricultural needs, are similar to the needs faced by people in remote communities, by people who live in sedentary environments, people like you and I who spend a lot of their days in the office and don't get enough physical exercise. So there are very strong synergies between space life sciences and practical benefits for people on the ground. Okay, so in conclusion, the Space Science Plan, which will be released next month in December, will point out how Australia can take advantage of its capabilities and expertise to grow opportunity, to grow productivity, to grow skilled employment, to grow sovereign capability, and to help protect critical assets as the global space system evolves and transforms. I mentioned the plan will be released in December. I encourage you all to have a look at the Academy website, the National Committee for Space and Radio Science website, for updates on when exactly that will happen. And of course, activities such as this are not possible without the support of our sponsors, and most particularly all the people who have so generously donated their time and expertise to this enterprise. They've all done it voluntarily. We've had many, many experts involved with this over a couple of years, and we're extremely thankful to people for that input. Thank you for your attention.